The Ted Bundy case, the killer who seduced his victims. Inside the mind of a monster. True Crimes, Chapter 1. The Mask of Sanity. In the collective memory of 1970s America, a landscape of fading Polaroid pictures, political upheaval, and burgeoning social freedoms, there exists a ghost. He is not a ghoulish figure lurking in the shadows of dilapidated mansions. He is handsome, well-dressed, his smile disarming. He's a law student, a volunteer at a crisis hotline, a political hopeful with a bright future. He is the man your parents would have approved of. His name is Theodore Robert Bundy, and his existence forces us to confront a terrifying truth. The most profound evil often wears a mask of perfect sanity. This story isn't just about the brutal acts he committed. It's about the chilling duality of a man who could charm a room with one hand while methodically destroying lives with the other. This case, which unfolded across the United States like a dark stain, became a national obsession, a cautionary tale whispered on college campuses from Washington to Florida. It was a time before 24-hour news cycles and DNA forensics dominated investigations. The search for this phantom killer was a desperate analog chase, pieced together with eyewitness sketches, tire tracks, and the harrowing testimonies of the few who escaped. His story has since been dissected in countless books, films, and documentaries, most notably in the Netflix series. Conversations with the Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes, which used his own voice to map the geography of his depravity. But hearing the voice and understanding the mind are two different journeys. We will journey back to that era of perceived innocence to uncover the story of the man who shattered it. We will not look for a simple monster, but for the complex, fractured human being who made a series of choices that led him down a path of unspeakable darkness. We will explore the predator who hid in plain sight, using society's own trust and empathy as his most effective weapon. Prepare to enter a world where charisma is a lure, and a helping hand can be the last thing you ever see. Because to understand Ted Bundy is to understand the terrifying fragility of the line that separates the normal from the nightmarish. How does a man become a symbol of pure evil while simultaneously appearing to be the all-American ideal? The answer is not simple, and it begins long before the first body was ever found. It begins in a house of secrets, where the first cracks in the facade started to form. Chapter 2. A House of Secrets. To understand the predator, one must first walk through the nursery of the child. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His very entry into the world was shrouded in shame. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was a young, unmarried woman from a deeply religious Philadelphia family. In the conservative atmosphere of post-war America, illegitimacy was a profound stain, a secret to be buried at all costs. And so the first lie of Ted's life was constructed. His grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, would raise him as their son. His own mother would play the role of his older sister. This fundamental deception became the bedrock of his identity, a fault line running deep beneath the surface of his psyche. The Cowell household was far from a sanctuary. Samuel Cowell, the man Ted knew as his father, was a figure of violent and unpredictable rage. He was known to beat his wife, the family dog, and even swing cats by their tails. He was a racist, a bigot, who harbored a deep well of anger that poisoned the home's atmosphere. Young Ted was a quiet, introverted boy, often left to navigate this volatile environment on his own. He was an observer, absorbing the tension, the unspoken rules of survival in a home governed by fear and deception. The architecture of his childhood was not one of warmth and stability, but of closed doors, whispered arguments, and the constant, humming anxiety of secrets waiting to be exposed. In 1951, seeking to escape this oppressive environment, Louise took her son and moved across the country to Tacoma, Washington, to live with cousins. There, she met and married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook who formally adopted Ted, giving him the name that would one day be infamous. But the new name did not erase the old wounds. The family grew with the addition of 4 half-siblings, and Ted, the quiet older brother, increasingly felt like an outsider in his own home. While his siblings shared a clear lineage, his own origins remained a murky, forbidden topic. This sense of otherness, of not truly belonging, festered within him. He was a performer, playing the part of a normal son and brother, but internally, he was wrestling with a profound identity crisis, fueled by the lie he was forced to live, the Pacific Northwest, with its misty skies, towering pines, and quiet suburban streets, became the backdrop for his formative years. It was a world of apparent normalcy, but for Ted, it was a stage. He learned to project an image of conformity, to be polite, to excel in school, but underneath, a different self was being forged in isolation and resentment. The world had presented him with a counterfeit identity, and in the dark recesses of his mind, he began to build a real one, a secret self defined not by love and acceptance, but by a growing need for power and control. What happens when a boy built on a foundation of lies decides to create his own truth? The early signs were subtle, easily missed, but they were there, like faint tremors before an earthquake. Chapter 3. The cracks in the facade. Adolescence is a crucible for identity, a time when the self is forged in the fires of social acceptance and rejection. For Ted Bundy, it was a period of intense, albeit hidden, struggle. On the surface, he was unremarkable, a shy but pleasant boy, a Boy Scout, a good student. Yet those who knew him well sensed an unnerving detachment, a wall behind his eyes that no one could penetrate. While his peers navigated the clumsy rituals of dating and friendship, Ted was cultivating his private world, a world fed by dark fantasies. He began engaging in voyeurism, peering into the windows of his neighbors, seeking a thrill in the stolen intimacy of other people's lives. This was his first real taste of power, the power of the unseen observer who holds a secret knowledge of the vulnerable. His transition to university was a masterclass in self-construction. On July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park, a popular recreation spot near Seattle, this method was put on full display. The sun was bright, the park crowded with families and students enjoying the summer day. Witnesses later recalled seeing a handsome man with his arm in a sling, asking for help loading a sailboat onto his beige Volkswagen Beetle. He approached several women. Most declined, but 2 did not. First, Janice Ott, a 23-year-old social worker, disappeared. Hours later, from the same park, 19-year-old Denise Naslund vanished. The man had introduced himself as Ted. The separate disappearances from the same location on the same day sent a wave of panic through the community. The phantom they had been reading about in the papers was real, and he was impossibly brazen. The moments of the crime itself were a brutal whiplash from charm to savagery. Once a victim was lured to his car and out of public view, the mask would drop. The weapon of choice was often a crowbar or a tire iron, a blunt instrument to render them unconscious with a swift, shocking blow. The violence was absolute and overwhelming. From there, he would transport them to a secondary, secluded location he had scouted in advance, wooded areas, remote dumping grounds. What happened in those final, terrifying moments is a testament to the depths of his depravity. He was not just a killer. He was a collector of lives. He engaged in acts of sexual assault and necrophilia, returning to the sites long after his victims were dead, sometimes for weeks or months. This was the ultimate expression of his power, total possession, even over death itself. The act of murder was not the end. It was the beginning of his true dark ritual. His victims were not anonymous to him. They were archetypes. Linda Ann Healy, Donna Gail Manson, Susan Elaine Rancourt, Roberta Kathleen Parks. They were bright, promising young women, students and daughters with futures that he stole in an instant. In our duty to tell this story, it's crucial we remember them not as statistics in Bundy's gruesome tally, but as individuals whose loss created an unfillable void. Their names deserve to be spoken with the same gravity as his. The respectful documentary approach requires us to stare into this abyss, not for the thrill of the horror, but to understand the profound human cost of one man's monstrous choices. The hunter was moving through their world, unseen and unopposed, leaving a trail of silent sorrow. Chapter 5. A Phantom in the Pacific Northwest. As the disappearances mounted through 1974, a palpable fear began to grip the Pacific Northwest. Washington and Oregon, states known for their serene landscapes and liberal-minded communities, were suddenly confronted with an invisible terror. The pattern was horrifyingly consistent. Young, bright, attractive female college students were vanishing without a trace. The term serial killer was not yet part of the public lexicon, but the public knew instinctively that these were not isolated incidents. A single, malevolent intelligence was at work. The media, picking up on the name given by witnesses at Lake Sammamish, dubbed the unknown assailant the Ted Killer. The name hung in the air on campuses like the University of Washington and Oregon State, a constant chilling reminder that one of them could be next. The public reaction was a mixture of panic, paranoia, and disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen here. The 1970s may have been a decade of disillusionment for America, scarred by Vietnam and Watergate. But these communities still felt insulated from the kind of predatory evil associated with sprawling, anonymous cities. Parents called their daughters at their dorms every night. The buddy system became an unspoken rule. Hitchhiking, once a common practice, became a terrifying gamble. The face of a helpful stranger was no longer a symbol of community, but a potential mask for a monster. The psychological toll was immense. The very fabric of trust that holds a society together began to fray. Newspapers ran composite sketches of the suspect, a handsome, clean-cut man, the kind of person you'd never suspect. This only amplified the fear. The monster wasn't a shadowy ghoul. He looked like their neighbor, their classmate, their brother. This paradox was deeply unsettling. It challenged the public's fundamental assumptions about what evil looked like. How could someone so normal be responsible for such abnormal cruelty? The case tapped into a primal fear, the betrayal of appearances. The emotions it stirred were complex. Not just fear, but a morbid curiosity and a desperate need for answers. Every citizen became an amateur detective, scrutinizing every beige Volkswagen Beetle, every handsome stranger. If this exploration of societal fear and suspicion makes you reflect on our modern world, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. How have our reactions to such crimes changed, or have they remained the same? When Bundy moved to Utah in the fall of 1974 to attend law school, the disappearances in Washington stopped, and a new wave of terror began in the Salt Lake City area. The geographic shift baffled investigators, but it cemented the idea that they were hunting a phantom, a killer who was intelligent, mobile, and always one step ahead. The fear he had cultivated in the Pacific Northwest was now spreading, crossing state lines, becoming a national nightmare. The country was slowly waking up to the reality that a new kind of predator was walking among them, a hunter who was not only deadly, but also disturbingly, terrifyingly ordinary. The pressure on law enforcement was his second escape. 6 months later from the Garfield County Jail was far more dramatic and consequential. Over weeks, he had chipped away at the ceiling of his cell, crawling into the space above and exploring the building's layout. On December 30th, 1977, he slipped out of the jail and into the snowy Colorado night, a free man once more. He made his way across the country to Florida, a state where no one knew his face. It was here, in a desperate final paroxysm of violence, that he would commit his most infamous crimes. On January 15th, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In a frenzied 15-minute blitz, he brutally attacked 4 women, killing 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. The savagery of the attack left even seasoned investigators speechless. Weeks later, he abducted and murdered his final victim, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. His capture in Pensacola, Florida, brought an end to the rampage and set the stage for one of the most sensational trials in American history. It was one of the first to be nationally televised, and the world watched, mesmerized. Bundy, once again acting as his own attorney, turned the Miami courtroom into his personal stage. He was charming, arrogant, and flirtatious, smiling at the female jurors and sparring with the judge. He seemed to relish the attention, performing for the cameras as if he were the star of a legal drama. It was a surreal spectacle, the man accused of heinous, animalistic acts behaving like a charismatic celebrity. All while the gut-wrenching details of his crimes were laid bare, the prosecution's case hinged on a crucial piece of forensic evidence. A bite mark had been left on the body of Lisa Levy. The prosecutors brought in Dr. Richard Suviron, a forensic odontologist, who made a cast of Bundy's distinctively crooked teeth. In a moment of high courtroom drama, an enlarged photograph of the bite mark was displayed, and Dr. Suviron placed a model of Bundy's teeth over it. It was a perfect match. The scientific evidence was undeniable, a silent, gruesome testimony that cut through all of Bundy's posturing. On July 24, 1979, the jury found him guilty. As the verdict was read, Bundy's carefully constructed mask of composure finally cracked, revealing the hollowed-out rage beneath. The performance was over. The devil in the courtroom had been condemned. Chapter 8. Prison and Reflection. For Ted Bundy, death row in Florida State Prison was not a place of quiet repentance. It was his final stage, his last forum for manipulation. For years, he maintained his innocence, filing endless appeals and portraying himself as a victim of a vast conspiracy. He became a macabre celebrity, receiving bags of fan mail, much of it from women who were inexplicably drawn to him. He cultivated these relationships, feeding his narcissistic need for adoration. The most public of these was with Carol Ann Boone, a former colleague who had stood by him throughout his trials. In a bizarre, legally questionable maneuver during his Florida trial, Bundy proposed to her on the witness stand, and they were declared married. She would later give birth to a daughter, Rose. Conceived during a prison visit, the most significant insights into his mind from this period come from a series of interviews conducted by journalists Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. For months, Bundy refused to confess, so the journalists tried a different tactic. They suggested he speak about the crimes hypothetically, in the third person, as an expert analyzing the killer's mindset. Bundy seized the opportunity. It allowed him to confess without confessing, to relive his crimes under the guise of academic speculation. He spoke of the entity, a malevolent force that drove the killer. He described in chilling detail the development of a predator, from a fascination with violent pornography to the compulsion to possess his victims. These recordings, which formed the basis for the book and later the Netflix series, are a terrifying window into the mechanics of a psychopathic mind. Self-serving, detached and utterly devoid of empathy, he never spoke of remorse. Instead, he spoke of the impulse and the hunt. His reflections were not on the lives he destroyed, but on the perceived injustices done to him. To the very end, he was the protagonist of his own tragic story. As his execution date neared and all legal avenues were exhausted, his strategy shifted. In a desperate, last-ditch effort to buy more time, he began to confess. He spoke to investigators, including Bob Keppel, the detective who had first hunted him in Washington. He admitted to dozens of murders, clearing up cold cases and leading authorities to the locations of remains. But these were not the confessions of a man seeking redemption. They were the final, calculated moves of a master manipulator, trading scraps of information for a few more hours of life. On the morning of January 24th, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in the electric chair. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered, cheering and setting off fireworks as the news of his death was announced. They celebrated the end of a monster. But for the families of his victims, there was no celebration, only the quiet, enduring pain of their loss. Bundy's final words were directed at his lawyer and a minister. "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Even in his last breath, he maintained the facade of a normal man, a loving son and friend, a final, defiant performance from the man who was, in reality, a void in human form. Chapter 9. Anatomy of a Predator. To label Ted Bundy simply as evil is to close the book on a question that demands to be examined. What specific psychological architecture allowed such a man to exist? The consensus among forensic psychologists and profilers points to a potent cocktail of personality disorders, primarily narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, the clinical term for what is commonly known as psychopathy. This was not a case of madness or a break from reality. It was a case of a fundamentally different kind of consciousness, one that operates without the guardrails of conscience and empathy. If this deep psychological dive is the kind of content that compels you, please consider hitting the like button to let us know we're on the right track. His narcissism was the engine of his entire being. He possessed a grandiose sense of self-importance, a belief that he was special, unique, and superior to everyone around him. This was likely a defense mechanism, a fortress built around the profound shame of his illegitimate birth and the insecurities of his youth. The rejection by his first love, Diane Edwards, was not just a heartbreak. It was a narcissistic injury of the highest order, an insult to his perceived greatness that fueled a lifelong, murderous rage against women who represented her. His performance in the courtroom, his insistence on representing himself, and his belief that he could outsmart the entire legal system were classic manifestations of this pathological grandiosity. He was not just the main character in his story. He was the only character that mattered. Layered over this was his psychopathy, the defining feature of his predatory nature. Psychopaths are not the raving lunatics of cinema. They are often calm, rational, and charming, a condition famously described by Dr. Hervey Cleckley as the mask of sanity. Key traits include a complete lack of empathy, an inability to form genuine emotional bonds, pathological lying, manipulativeness, and a disregard for social norms and the rights of others. Bundy was a textbook case. He could volunteer at a suicide crisis hotline, calmly talking people down from the brink, and then leave his shift to go hunting. This was not hypocrisy. It was the compartmentalization of a predator who saw other people not as fellow human beings, but as objects, instruments for his gratification. His crimes were the ultimate expression of this pathology. They were not crimes of passion. They were crimes of possession. He didn't just want to kill his victims. He wanted to own them, to exert absolute power and control over them in a way he never could in his real life. The necrophilia, the keeping of souvenirs, the returning to the burial sites, all of these were rituals of possession, ways of prolonging his sense of dominance. His mind was a chillingly rational machine, dedicated to a single purpose, feeding his ego and satisfying his depraved urges, regardless of the human cost. He was not broken. In a terrifying way, he was exquisitely functional at being what he was, a perfectly evolved predator in human form. Chapter 10. The Shadow That Lingers. The legacy of Ted Bundy is not simply the tally of his victims or the brutality of his acts. His most enduring and terrifying legacy is the destruction of a sacred trust. He proved that the monster doesn't always have fangs and claws. Sometimes he has a winning smile and a law degree. He walked through the world cloaked in the privilege of his appearance, white, handsome, educated, and articulate. He weaponized our instinct to trust, to help, to see the good in others. The shadow that he casts is the chilling realization that the facade of normalcy can conceal a bottomless abyss. He forces us to acknowledge that the people we live beside, work with, and trust might be leading secret lives we cannot even begin to fathom. His case forever changed law enforcement, highlighting the desperate need for interstate cooperation and helping to spur the development of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and the practice of psychological profiling. He became the dark archetype against which future serial killers would be measured. But beyond the procedural changes, he left an indelible scar on the cultural psyche. He became a symbol of a particular kind of American darkness, the evil that grows in the manicured lawns of suburbia, nurtured by secrets and resentment. He shattered the comforting myth that you can know a person by their cover. As we close this file, we are left with the profound and unsettling questions that Bundy's life provokes. Was this monster created in that Vermont house of secrets, shaped by the shame of his birth and the violence of his grandfather? Or was the seed of this darkness already there, a genetic miswiring that was simply waiting for the right conditions to sprout? Was he a product of his environment or a freak of nature? In his final interviews, he tried to blame pornography and a decaying society for his actions, a last, desperate act of deflecting responsibility. But the truth feels both simpler and more complex. It feels like a series of choices, made in the quiet, unseen theater of his own mind, that led him further and further into the shadow until he became the shadow itself. This brings us to the final, haunting question that every case like this forces us to confront. Is evil something that happens to us, a product of trauma and circumstance? Or is it something that lives in us, a dormant capacity we all possess? If this story has intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to explore other true crimes that have shocked the world and the minds behind them.